Hello YouTube. In the last video we saw a couple of different ways of defining evolutionary progress. We might try to define progress as increasing fitness over time, and the problem with that is that there doesn't seem to be any particular reason to expect fitness to increase as a long-term trend, and even if there was a reason to expect this, it's not obvious how we could make it testable. Now perhaps the most popular proposal is that evolutionary progress consists in an increase in complexity, and this is, I think, fairly intuitive. We start out with microbes with simple prokaryotic cells, and then we have eukaryotic cells with membrane-bound organelles, and then we get multicellular organisms with differentiated tissues, and the plants and the animals and so on. It does look like there's an increase in complexity there. Furthermore, increasing complexity would sort of fit with some of the other examples we've seen. So we saw in the last video that one problem with defining progress in terms of adaptation to a range of environments is that selection often produces increasing specialization. Well, increasing specialization seems to involve an increase in complexity. It increases the divergence of forms. So, maybe this idea of identifying progress with complexity can be made to work. But the first question is, well, what exactly is complexity? Of course, we all have an intuitive idea. Intuitively, complexity seems to involve functional sophistication, lots of parts working together, lots of different types of materials and so on. But obviously we need to give a precise definition. Robert Brandon and Daniel McShay, in their book Biology's First Law, suggest the definition that complexity is the amount of differentiation among parts. So in this image, for example, you can see that B is more complex than A because it has more differentiation in the parts that make it up. That's despite the fact that B has fewer parts than A. The point is that its parts are more differentiated. A is just made up of these little circles, B is made up of different ovals and a square and a triangle. So it's more differentiated. And this differentiation of parts, that's all that Brandon and McShay mean by complexity. Now bear in mind that complexity in this sense is relative to the level of evaluation. So think about a fish. Well, on the level of tissues and organs, it's going to have maybe 90 different types of parts, right? It has maybe 90 different types of tissues and organs. Drop down to the cellular level, it has about 120 different types of cells. And of course, on the atomic level, it contains only maybe 6 different types of atoms in any significant quantity. Obviously, we'll have lots of other atoms in trace amounts, but it's just going to be about 6 in a significant amount. So we have different degrees of complexity at different levels. You might imagine instead an animal with 80 different types of tissues and organs, but 130 different types of cells. This would be more complex at the cellular level, but less complex on the level of the tissues and organs. So given this definition of complexity, it looks like there's no question that there has been increasing complexity over time, just because the world started out with simple microbes, and now we have all sorts of different organisms with very differentiated parts. But we can ask, what exactly has caused this increase? In the last video, we identified 2 different aspects of progress: directional trend and improvement. But arguably, not just any kind of trend will do. A distinction is drawn between what we call driven trends and passive trends. So a trend basically is just a directional change in some statistic. And there are different ways that you can get a directional change. So this image represents 3 possibilities for changes in complexity over the history of life. So what we have here is that we have time here on the y-axis, and then complexity on the x-axis, and complexity increases as you go to the right. Now, here this represents species, and each branching represents the creation of a new species. So you have newer species being born from the older ones each time you have a branch to the each time you have a horizontal branch. So as we sort of move to the right, the species become more and more complex. Now in this first example, shown in A and B, when new species arise, they are almost always of greater complexity. There are a few that are simpler, but almost all of them you can see get increasingly complex. And that means that both the minimum and the maximum complexity increase. And this is what we call a strongly driven trend. In a strongly driven trend, the majority of changes are in one particular direction. So that increases both the minimum and the maximum. And it's immediately obvious in this case that some sort of evolutionary force is at work. If we saw this kind of pattern, we would say that selection favours greater complexity for whatever reason. We'll now consider case C here. This is what we call a weakly driven trend. In this case, the average, the mean value of complexity increases over time. And there's still a bias towards greater complexity. So if you count the branch points, you'll see that most of the branching is to the left. So there's still some kind of force at work here, force or drive at work here. But decreases occur quite often, and importantly, the minimum value remains occupied. Finally, there is a passive trend. Again, the mean value increases, it's a trend, but there's no bias. The increases and decreases of complexity occur with equal frequency. This case is interesting because we have a trend that is not produced by any kind of force or drive. The trend here is produced simply because we have a boundary. There's a minimum possible amount of complexity. And because we start out at the minimum, an increase in average complexity happens just by chance. In fact, notice that even if there was selection for lower complexity, provided that increases can happen occasionally, you're going to expect a drift away from the minimum. As long as you can get occasional increases in complexity, you will get a passive trend if you start out at minimum complexity. So consider the following simple game, coin toss game. You start with a token at the left-hand side of the board. With each turn, you move up one space. You flip a coin, and if it lands tails, you move left. If it lands heads, you move right. But you can't move off the board. So if you land tails on the first turn, well, obviously the only thing you can do is just move up. You can't move to the left. And what you'll find over the course of this game is that you drift to the right, simply because you started out at the left boundary. Even if there was a bias towards, the coin was weighted so that there was a bias towards movements to the left, you'd still get this average drift to the right. This is a passive trend. So taking Brandon and McShane's definition of complexity as differentiation of parts, complexity is quite straightforwardly empirically quantifiable, so we cannot identify trends in complexity. Now, it looks like the complexity over the history of life doesn't exhibit a strongly driven trend. Recall, as we discussed in the previous video, that the vast majority of organisms are microbes, no more complex than those existing 3 billion years ago. So there hasn't been any increase in minimum complexity, or at least that's the standard view. I should say I'm actually a little bit skeptical of that, just because it's, we can't really study the microbes of 3 billion years ago. I mean, we do have some fossil evidence of them, but we can't sort of analyze them under a microscope and check what they're like internally. Actually, many modern microbes are really quite complex in terms of their structures. They have structures like flagella, and so it seems possible to me that actually the minimum complexity has increased. But the standard view is that the minimum complexity has remained basically the same. And assuming that the minimum complexity has, that the minimum has remained occupied, the question then is going to be between a weakly driven trend and a passive trend. And the evidence from the fossil record isn't immediately clear on this point. Life, we assume, must have started near the minimum of complexity. So the average complexity could have increased just passively, just by chance processes. Stephen Jay Gould uses this point to argue against evolutionary progress. He thinks that the increase in average complexity was merely a passive trend. So the question is there any reason to think that the rise in complexity could have been a driven trend? Well, in the last video, I mentioned this idea from Lamarck that there is a force driving species towards greater complexity. And Lamarck thought that this force arose due to the action of fluids on soft tissues. Lamarck was wrong. But a Lamarckian idea has been resurrected recently by Brandon and McShay. They call it the zero-force evolutionary law, or this abbreviation, which is pronounced ZEFL. And it says that in any evolutionary system in which there is variation and heredity, there is a tendency for complexity to increase, one that is always present but that may be opposed or augmented by natural selection, other forces, or constraints acting on complexity. Actually, I've simplified that a little bit. Their original formulation concerned both complexity and diversity, but that's a technical point that doesn't really need to concern us here. So this is called the zero-force evolutionary law because it's supposed to tell us what happens in the absence of any evolutionary forces. And this is analogous to the zero-force condition in Newtonian mechanics. Newton's law of inertia tells us that an object moving at a velocity v will remain at v unless acted on by a net force. If you remove all the forces on an object, it remains at its current velocity. That's a kind of zero-force law in Newtonian mechanics. Similarly, the ZEFL tells us that unless acted on by an external force, biological entities will complexify. They will drift in the direction of greater complexity. So what underlies the ZEFL is the action of randomness. Random diffusion at one level produces a directional increase in complexity at the next highest level. So take this scenario here. Suppose we start with these, how many is it? 6 particles at position 0. So we have this ensemble of particles at position 0. Now at each time interval they move up one space, and they can move to the right or the left depending on a coin toss. So you've got a 0.5 chance of moving left, a 0.5 chance of moving right. And after 4 steps you might end up with something like this. The point here is that you can see that the variance has increased. From the point of view of a single particle, if you just look at it from the point of view of this one particle, well, nothing interesting has happened. It's just drifted around randomly. But this purely random behavior of each individual particle has produced an increase in the variance of the whole ensemble. They all started at 0, and now you can see that they vary from -4 to 2. So it's produced an increase in variance. And if you keep running this model, the variance will continue to increase indefinitely. And we can apply this to the case of biological systems. So suppose that these points represent populations of laboratory bacteria. We might begin with populations of bacteria that are exactly identical. And we keep the populations of bacteria in exactly identical situations. We know that due to mutation and due to genetic drift, they will gradually diversify. Even if there's no differing selective forces acting on them, even if nothing is introduced from the outside, just by chance the variation in the laboratory populations will tend to increase. You will get an increase in the complexity of the species. And that's why people working with bacteria, you can't just put the bacteria in a dish and leave them. You've got to freeze them so that you have identical clones to work with, because if you let the bacteria live and reproduce, they will gradually diverge, gradually change. Or these points might represent copies of the genome of a single organism. Suppose when we start off at 0, all of its cells have exactly the same genome. Copying errors as the cells divide will cause the genomes to diversify, making the organism more complex. Random processes produce a directional increase in complexity. Or, to use Brandon and McShay's example, consider a population of worm-like animals consisting of various identical segments. Again, suppose there is no selection. Well, then over the next generations, genetic mutation will produce increasing differentiation. As the genetic mutations accumulate, the ancestors of the original worm will increasingly diverge, just as we see here. Of course, I should note that this may not be randomness in the technical sense. Perhaps the world is deterministic. The point is that the changes that occur are random with respect to each other. Think of it like a coin toss. if we could specify all of the initial conditions, we would be able to predict exactly how the coin will land. In fact, I think there are people who've actually built robots that can flip coins so precisely that they always land heads or always land tails. But the point is that when a human flips a coin, we can't control those initial conditions. So the initial conditions for each flip are independent of the others, and it's just not possible for us to predict which way it's going to go. The Zeffel depends on randomness in this kind of sense, which obviously is ubiquitous in biology. It depends on coin toss randomness. The Zeffel tells us what happens when no evolutionary forces act, but there may be many forces and constraints opposing the Zeffel. For example, there may be selection for lower complexity. Perhaps greater complexity tends to require more energy input, and that might make selection favour simplicity. And obviously, when complexity is introduced into important structures, it can interfere with their functioning. So I mean, there's a great deal of stabilising selection that keeps certain DNA sequences the same, and it keeps certain physical structures the same, like the eye and so on. And there are also constraints. So Brandon and McShay point out that it's obvious, for example, that tetrapods can only have two types of limb pairs just because they only have two pairs of limbs. So that places a limit on the degree of complexity that it's possible for tetrapod limbs to have. Now, of course, this constraint can be removed if a tetrapod were to be born with three pairs of limbs. But again, there may be a great deal of selection against that. The point is that even given such forces and constraints, the Zeffel operates all the time at every biological level. There is a universal tendency for complexity to increase in biological macromolecules, in cells, in organs, in organisms, in species. Organisms develop increasing complexity as their cells differentiate. Cells become more complex as the organelles and macromolecules inside them differentiate. There is always and everywhere a drive towards greater complexity. So recall our earlier discussion of different types of trends. Now, one thing we might be concerned about with the Zeffel is that in itself it seems to predict a strongly driven trend, because the claim is that complexity increases there's a tendency for complexity to increase always and everywhere. And so you'd think that would result in an increase in the minimum complexity as well as the maximum. As I mentioned, the actual data are seen as suggesting a weakly driven trend. We think the minimum has not increased. Now, Brandon and McShay admit that the data on this point seem to disconfirm the Zeffel. However, recall the point that other tendencies work against the Zeffel. So we might compare this to Darwin's argument that all populations tend to increase at an exponential rate. If resources are abundant and if there is no predation or disease, a population of animals will tend to double or triple in size every generation. This rapid increase in population size is what you find if you introduce bacteria to agar, or if a species invades a new area. Rabbits in Australia. I think when rabbits were first introduced in Australia, their population just exploded exponentially. But obviously these are very special circumstances. We very rarely observe population size increasing exponentially because in the real world resources are limited, offspring are often killed. The point is that there's a tendency for an exponential increase, even if there are strong constraints. And in the same way, there is a tendency for complexity to increase. Even if complexity is in fact reducing, that tendency is still acting. One interesting consequence of this view, if this is right, is that progress is a product of randomness. Insofar as simplicity is the result of selection, we would have to say that selection actually acts against progress. So that's just an interesting consequence, because as we discussed in the earlier video, often some attempts to define progress have attempted to define it in terms of adaptation, in terms of fitness, which are concepts connected to natural selection. But this view seems to come at it from a somewhat different perspective, and it seems to entail that selection will often act against progress. Now, of course, all of this discussion assumes that we can link progress to complexity. Should we accept this? Is increasing complexity progress? After all, the complexity of an organism increases throughout its life. In particular, there will be an increase in the complexity of the genome due to copying errors, as I mentioned earlier. As your cells divide, the DNA sequences in those cells will diverge due to copying errors. We probably wouldn't call that progress. Indeed, it can cause problems. So we might think, well, okay, we have an interesting trend, but we shouldn't think of this trend as involving any kind of improvement. And there are 2 points that are often made in response to this. First of all, the Zeffel operates on every biological level. And it's true that if we look at it from the point of view of a cell or an organism, or maybe even a species, it doesn't really seem to entail any improvement. But remember that the point of evolutionary progress is we're talking about the whole history of life. This is a claim about macroevolution over a large timescale. Now, considered over the whole history of life, the Zeffel promotes divergence and diversification. It pushes species into different niches. It helps to produce all of the very striking morphological differences we see throughout the living world. And that, of course, is this fact, these morphological differences, the diversity of species. That's one of the things that motivated the thought of evolutionary progress in the first place. A second point is that complexity promotes evolutionary innovation. Increasing complexity in itself is not going to produce adaptations, but it opens up new opportunities for adaptations to arise. Increasing complexity will provide new raw materials for selection to work with. An example of this is what's known as neo-functionalization. A very important mechanism for genetic variation is gene duplication, where a gene is duplicated so there are 2 copies of the gene in the genome. And because there are 2 copies, we have redundancy. Because there's 1 copy carrying out the ancestral function, you don't really need 2 copies. So there'll be no selective pressure on the other copy, and it will start to accumulate random mutations. And this random mutation often produces what are known as pseudogenes. This is just a gene that has lost its function. However, occasionally the random mutation will produce a gene that codes for proteins, but that has a different function from the original gene. This accumulation of random mutation is the Zeffel. We start out with 2 identical copies, and because selection pressure is removed from one of the copies, they start diverging. The divergence can create new novel genes that perform useful functions. So we see that increasing complexity acts to provide raw material for selection to work with. So for these reasons, it seems that the Zeffel perhaps does provide a basis for evolutionary progress in a certain sense. Now, before we end, I'll raise one problem for understanding evolutionary progress in terms of the Zeffel. The claim is that the Zeffel acts always and in every lineage to increase complexity. But crucially, you will only see an increase in complexity when the Zeffel is unopposed by other forces and constraints. This raises the question, how much influence does the Zeffel actually have on evolutionary history? As an analogy, consider the development of natural selection. Darwin's basic argument for natural selection is pretty much watertight. The claim is that when you have variation, heredity, and differential reproduction, you must have natural selection. Different variants will survive and reproduce at different rates, and these survivors pass on their special features to their offspring. So there's no question that this occurs, but the importance of natural selection is going to depend on what exactly is the nature of variation in the real world. I mean, natural selection surely happens, but whether or not it is a kind of the amount of power it has as an evolutionary force depends on various other facts. In Darwin's time, many biologists held that there were strict limits to the amount of variation available to a species. Take dogs, for example. Some dogs are smaller, some dogs are larger. You have variation there, and we can selectively breed dogs to get them bigger and bigger. But eventually you'll hit a wall. you'll never breed a dog as big as an elephant. It seems that that variation in real species occurs within limits. You can't break outside those limits. Well, that's how it seemed at the time. Of course, today we have a much better understanding of how genetics works, and we know that yes, there are limits to variation, but with new mutations, those limits can be expanded. So over many thousands of years, variation may well arise that would allow dogs to be as big as elephants, or at least they could evolve into something as big as elephants. But in Darwin's day, the genetics wasn't understood so well, and it's clear that if you think that variation has unbreakable limits, well, obviously natural selection is going to be a very minor force in evolution. It won't be able to account for the emergence of new species. It took a great deal of empirical work on the nature of variation and genetics and so on to establish that selection played an important role in evolution. And the same is true of the Zeffel. In principle, the claim of increasing complexity due to the action of randomness is pretty much unquestionable, right? I mean, you can show with these coin-tossing games and so on how variance increases due to randomness. But the degree to which the Zeffel influences the evolutionary process depends on various other factors, like the role of selection, and these haven't been worked out yet. Perhaps there are almost always forces opposing the Zeffel, just as there are almost always forces preventing exponential increases in population size. So even with this complexifying drive in the background, whether it actually produces evolutionary progress would remain to be seen. But anyway, that is one idea we might have for defending the concept of evolutionary progress. That's all we're going to talk about this video. Thanks for watching.